There is something about a cold night that makes the ordinary feel wrong. The way silence stretches a little too long, the way a shadow in the corner of your eye doesn't quite move the way shadows should, the way you get up, not because you heard anything, but because something deep inside you says, you should check the door. You tell yourself it's nothing. You always tell yourself it's nothing. Tonight I'm going to tell you about 3 people who told themselves the same thing. A nurse who stopped to help a woman stranded in a blizzard and spent the rest of his life wishing he hadn't. A family who rented a winter cabin for a quiet week, away until their 7-year-old daughter started talking to someone no one else could see. And a woman, alone in a farmhouse during an ice storm, who heard 3 slow knocks on her front door at exactly the same time every single night. And on the 4th night, decided to find out where they were coming from. Pull your blanket tighter, turn down the lights. These stories are not urban legends. They are not campfire myths. These are the kinds of accounts that real people carry with them for years, unable to explain and completely unable to forget. Welcome to True Terror Files, official your home for true horror stories, real paranormal encounters, and the kind of unsolved mysteries that make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the dark. If you're new here, welcome, and consider this your warning. What you hear on this channel has a way of following you home. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because we drop new horror every week. And tonight's stories are some of the most unsettling we've ever covered. Before we begin, get comfortable, because we have 3 full stories tonight. No rush, no filler. Just the kind of slow, creeping dread that builds the longer you sit with it. These are stories told in the dark. 4 nights exactly like this one. But let's begin. Story 1, The Woman on County Road 9. Marcus Elway was 38 years old, registered nurse who had spent 12 years working the night shift at Whitmore General Hospital in a rural pocket of upstate New York, a part of the state where January blizzards were legendary, where a single overnight storm could bury a mailbox, close the schools, and turn the county roads into something that tested every driver who dared them. And Marcus had driven County Road 9 1,000 times, knew every curve and frost heave and stretch where the pine trees pressed so close to the shoulder that your headlights seemed to vanish into walls of black. And on the night of January 14th, he was heading home from a double shift, nearly 2 in the morning. Temperature at 9 degrees below zero, the storm, the weather service had been tracking all week, arriving with a ferocity that turned his windshield into a white wall and forced him to center death on his senhide. And he was walking hard into twird, and he was tendered in and bide, and he was working a setter wide, and he was straggling mind, whiter strucking in, minding, mind are it ain't, mind up sendide when, well, Bible spin rib, I'm right. Wine, I'm well, and what, I'm out, when whistle, with it, what for with them, with that, with them, what for, the what must, I go to something, what to sell, the way I sister, what to do, the feel, and I don't know, I'm going, if I want to know with that, there's no little woman, the word of it, but it's a lump with it, wood, and it's what's in it, and that's it, what it is. 40 yards ahead, completely motionless, not waving, not stumbling, not turning toward the sound of his engine, simply standing, facing him, arms at her sides. And Marcus eased the brakes carefully, felt the car drift a few feet on the packed snow, and came to a stop roughly 10 feet from where she stood. And in the full wash of his headlights, he could see her clearly young. Early 20s, dark hair pressed flat against her face by the wind, wearing a white dress, not a coat, not boots, not anything appropriate for 9 degrees in a blizzard, just a thin white dress that snapped and twisted in the wind while she stood in it without flinching. And Marcus, because he was a nurse, and his first instinct was always triage, concluded she was in shock, a car accident maybe, somewhere back up the road, and stepped into the screaming cold and called out to her, and she didn't respond, didn't look at him, and he approached and lent her and hit cold, the way intent in and hit, and he approached and looked, and he approached and he approached and he approached and he approached and hit under poor Im's paw. Up. Bun when I went out to win Sawas and as I went and that one I was the what I would down and I my way forward I was way I went It was cold the way marble is cold, the way the earth is cold when you dig past the frost line in January. And he guided her to the passenger door, helped her in, turned the heat vents toward her, and asked her name, and she said nothing, staring straight ahead through the windshield. And he asked if she was injured. Nothing. And asked where she lived. And after a long, heavy silence, she raised her right hand and pointed down the road in the direction he had been traveling. And so he drove, asking questions every few minutes, and receiving only a pointing hand in reply left here straight. Slow down, and somewhere around the 15th minute he noticed that despite the heat blasting from his vents, and the fog of his own breath clouding the air, the woman beside him was producing no vapor at all. Not a single trace of condensation from her lips or nostrils. And he told himself the car hadn't fully warmed, that she was too cold, that there was an explanation. And he told himself a lot of things in the next 20 minutes as she directed him down an unpaved road barely visible beneath the snow and through a tunnel of leaning bare trees until she pointed one final time, straight ahead, and his headlights landed on the ruin of a farmhouse, not abandoned. Burned, the walls charred down 2 blackened studs on one side, the roof caved in, windows long since gone, the front doorway open to the dark sky. No tracks in the surrounding snow, no vehicle, nothing breathing, and Marcus turned to tell her they had the wrong address, that she needed a hospital, that something was wrong, and the seat beside him was empty. The door had not opened. He had not heard a single sound, and he sat in that idling car for a very long time before he drove away. And the next morning, with his wife beside him, and his hands still not entirely steady, he looked up the property record for the address at the end of that road, and he found a local newspaper article from November 1987 reporting the death of a 22-year-old woman named Claire Dubois, struck and killed by a passing vehicle on County Road 9 during a blizzard while walking home from a friend's house, identified at the scene, the article noted, by the white dress she was wearing. The property at the end of the unpaved track, the burned ruin, had been her family's home, destroyed by a fire for years after her death, and Marcus Elway still lives in that county. Still works at the hospital, still takes the long way home in winter, and he has told this story only a handful of times in the decades since. Always stopping at the same point, always delivering the final detail the same quiet way, that when he stepped out of the car in front of that burned house and looked back at the road they'd traveled, he could see his own footprints from where he'd walked around the car, and 2 tracks of tire marks pressed into the snow. and no other marks anywhere. And then he looked at the passenger window from outside, and on the glass and the frost that had formed on the exterior surface was a handprint for fingers and a thumb pressed clearly into the frost from the inside of the locked car. Story 2. What breathed in the attic? Sarah and Derek Holt had been married 9 years when they booked a week at a rental cabin in the Green Mountains of Vermont. The kind of property with a crackling fireplace in the listing photos and reviews that used words like magical and perfectly secluded and will definitely be back. And they arrived on a Friday evening with their 7-year-old daughter Lily and 3 bags of groceries and the particular relief of people who have needed a break for too long. Hauled everything through a foot of fresh powder, lit the fireplace, and stood in the amber glow of the main room and completely felt that they had made the right choice. The cabin was beautiful. Low ceilings and rough wood walls and copper pots above the stove, and upstairs 2 bedrooms connected by a hallway that ended at a door. Their rental listing had mentioned in a single small line as storage not included in rental, and they had not thought about that door again. Not that first evening, not while they made dinner or tucked Lily in, or sat together by the fire long after she was asleep. And it was past midnight on their first night when Sarah woke to find Lily standing in the bedroom doorway, wide-eyed and very still, asking in the soft, careful voice children use when they are trying not to be frightened. "Do you hear the man upstairs walking?" And Sarah listened, heard the cabin settling, heard wind against the eaves, told Lily it was just an old house, and walked her back to bed, and thought nothing more of it. And on the second night it was Derek who woke first, not from a sound, but from a feeling, that specific, ancient, skin-tightening sense of being watched from behind your own closed eyes, and he lay still for a moment, then turned toward the window, and the window of their bedroom was on the 2nd floor, looking out over the snow-covered yard 12 feet below. And on the glass, and the frost on the exterior surface, were 2 handprints, both hands, fingers spread, pressed clearly and firmly against the outside of the pane from beyond the glass. And Derek got up without waking. Sarah took his flashlight, went outside into the snow, and found no footprints beneath that window, no ladder, no marks of any kind in the snow around the perimeter of the cabin. And the wall below that window was flat and unbroken, nothing to grip, nowhere to stand. And he went back inside and said nothing to Sarah, and told himself there was an explanation. And on the 3rd night, Lily refused to go to bed, sat on the living room floor with her knees to her chest and her eyes fixed on the ceiling above her, and said, to no one in particular, in a voice more matter-of-fact than frightened, "He's coming down tonight." And Sarah asked who, and Lily pointed upward, not vaguely at the ceiling, not at the room in general, but directly, with the precision of a child pointing at something specific at the storage door at the end of the upstairs hallway. And it was Derek who found the latch recessed behind the edge of the bookshelf, barely visible, not locked, and he pulled it and found a narrow staircase behind it, and both of them climbed those stairs with the flashlight held between them. And at the top was a small room with a bare dead bulb above, and a stained mattress on the floor and walls that were covered. From the baseboard to the ceiling, in photographs, dozens, maybe 100, some old and faded and curling at the corners, some more recent, and every single photograph was of the cabin. Different seasons, different years, different families, visible through windows or on the porch or in the yard, and in every photograph, if you looked carefully, and they looked very carefully, there was a figure sometimes at the edge of the tree line, sometimes barely visible in a darkened window, sometimes in a doorway left slightly ajar, always still, always present, always watching whoever occupied the cabin that season, and the most recent photograph was pinned directly at eye level above the mattress and showed the front porch of the cabin in winter, snow on the railing, porch light on, and through the front window, 3 figures were visible in the warm interior light: a man, a woman, a small child. And Derek took it down and turned it over, and on the back, in small, careful handwriting, was a date, and the date was 3 nights from now. And he showed it to Sarah without speaking, and before either of them could say anything, from directly below them on the main floor of the cabin came their daughter's voice, small and calm and perfectly composed. "Mommy, he says he wants to meet you now." They left that night, all 3 of them, coats thrown over pajamas, bags abandoned, and drove for hours in the dark without stopping, and Sarah told a close friend about it months later in pieces. "The way you tell a story you haven't finished surviving yet," and the friend asked if they had taken anything from the room, and Sarah said no, then paused and said that Derek had kept one thing, the photograph, and that she had found it once in his nightstand, and that on the back, beneath the printed date in that careful handwriting, there was now a second line, written in Derek's hand, in ink she didn't recognize from any pen they owned. And she asked him when he had written it, and he said he didn't remember writing it. Story 3. 3 Knocks. Nora Whitfield was not a woman who frightened easily. 43 years old, born and raised in rural Michigan, a person who had weathered blackouts and ice storms and the specific heavy silence of winter nights in an old farmhouse surrounded by dead fields and frozen creek beds, without ever once losing her footing. Her husband Paul traveled for work 3 or 4 nights a week, and Nora had long since made peace with the empty house, had almost come to prefer it. The silence familiar and comfortable, a thing she wore like a coat until the first night of February, when the ice storm arrived and turned every surface outside into glass, and the porch light caught the ice-covered yard and shattered it into cold white fragments, and Nora had fallen asleep on the couch with the television on the way she always did when Paul was away, and she was woken at 3:17 in the morning by 3 knocks on her front door. Not frantic, not loud, 3 slow and deliberate knocks, spaced as if whoever was making them had all the time in the world, and she sat up and muted the television and listened. Heard nothing more, went to the door, turned on the porch light, looked through the peephole, saw nothing, opened the door, and found the porch and steps and front walk completely undisturbed, the ice unbroken, the snow beneath it smooth and untouched, no footprints anywhere in any direction. And she closed and locked the door and went back to the couch and told herself it was the ice contracting. Branches snapping under their frozen weight, the sounds a glazed world makes when it breathes in the cold, and she went to sleep eventually and did not mention it to Paul when he called in the morning. And on the second night, the ice had not melted, and Paul was still away, and at 3:17 a.m., the knocks came again. Exactly 3, exactly the same weight and pace. And Nora went to the door immediately and pulled it open fast, and found the porch empty, but this time, standing in the open doorway with the cold pressing against her face. She could see across the iced front yard all the way to where the gravel drive met the tree line 60 yards away. And there in the snow was a trail of footprints, a single set, large, human-shaped, leading from the darkness between the pines across the yard and up the porch steps to where she stood, and then turning and leading back, the same measured pace. Back across the yard and back to the tree line and into the dark, as if someone had walked to her door and simply turned around, and she called Paul, and his voice was careful and calm the way it gets when he is managing his own alarm, and he said it was probably a neighbor checking on her, a deer, something ordinary, and she did not sleep at all that night. And on the third night at 3:17, the knocks came again, and Nora stood at the open door and watched the footprints come from the tree line across the yard in the glow of the porch light, and she could see this time that the returning trail did not go back the way it came. It led around the side of the house, toward the back, and she did not follow it. She deadbolted the door and turned on every light in the house and sat at the kitchen table until morning. And Paul drove home on icy roads the next day, brought their neighbor Cal, a man who had lived in the county his whole life, and the three of them followed the trail from the third night in daylight around the side of the house, across the backyard, through the dead garden, across the frozen open field behind the barn. The footprints perfectly preserved in the ice, evenly spaced, unhurried. 130 yards of open ground, walked at a pace that suggested no urgency whatsoever, and the trail led without a single deviation to the edge of the frozen pond behind the far fence. And at the center of the pond the ice was broken, not fallen through, not cracked by weight from above. Broken upward, the jagged edges pushed toward the sky, the black water beneath it under the cowrie, the black water beneath it, the black water beneath, touring to a tire. Stood in a state and stayed, and on state so twint selt, teen selt, prenter and count, tend intent, coundo, point, count, and zoom in. One, red, bottom, on runt separates and bouts, up and west into barn, on the end so on it, right, it's and what it can And Paul asked him what that meant, and Cal looked at the broken ice and at the footprints that ended at the water's edge, the footprints that led in and did not lead out, and said slowly that it meant whatever had been coming to her door had not come from the woods at all, that it had been in the water the whole time, and they sold the farmhouse that spring. And the night before the closing, Nora told her closest friend the one thing she had never told anyone, not Paul, not Cal, not the county sheriff, who had come and filed a report and found nothing actionable, that on the second night she stood in the open doorway and found the footprints. Before she even noticed them, she had stood there for just a moment in the cold and heard something from out across the dark, frozen field, faint but unmistakable, coming from beneath the ice of the pond 60 yards behind the house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from under the frozen surface, answering her. 3 stories, 3 cold nights. 3 things that have no explanation the rational mind is comfortable accepting. I always find myself sitting with the same question after a night like this one. How many sounds do we dismiss? How many things wait just outside the edge of light, patient, unhurried, while we lock our doors and tell ourselves we heard nothing? If tonight's stories got under your skin, if they're already following you down the hallway, subscribe to True Terror Files Official and turn on the notification bell. New horror drops every week, and we're just getting started. Tell me in the comments which of tonight's 3 stories stayed with you the most. I read every single one. Stay safe, stay warm, whatever you do tonight. Don't answer if someone knocks.